Good evening, everyone. I'm Elaine Bedel. Welcome to the Bedel Financial Forum. I wish we could all be together. I would love to see your faces and be with you as we normally are. But given the times, we need to get through this pandemic. So being safe, staying healthy is probably the better way to go. But hopefully next year we'll be back and we'll be able to do it. But you know, the show must go on. So here we find ourselves. Now, normally we have a little bit of a cocktail reception before this event. So I'm hoping that each of you have found a glass of wine or whatever your beverage of choice might be, and that you found your comfortable chair and you're ready for a fun evening. And you will not be disappointed. Greg Valliere has joined us many times in the past, usually right before an election, and he's always given us lots of interesting things to think about. But before we move forward with more formal introductions of Greg, let me first say thank you. Thank you to all the clients who have joined us tonight. We so much enjoy working with you, and we're here to serve you however we can. And for those of you who aren't clients who have joined us, let this be your invitation. We'd love to hear from you and share with you what we can do and how we might be able to help you as well. So that door is always open. One more thing I do need to say, I would be remiss if I didn't say a big thank you to the BFC, for the Bedel Financial staff family. They have really stepped up. As many of you know, I'm working with the governor and lieutenant governor right now via the Indiana Destination Development Corporation. And the team at Bedel Financial has really shown their dedication to the firm and to all of you as clients. So I certainly want to express my appreciation for all of that. So again, thank you for attending tonight. Again, would love to see you all, but we'll do that again next year. So let me turn it over to Evan for further introductions. Enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Elaine, and welcome to my home and to my office for the last 7 months. Cannot believe it's been 7 months. For me, it all started with e-learning. I never want to do that again. For the rest of my life, if I don't have to do e-learning, I will live a very happy life. Next, social distancing. I like social distancing, right? I hope we continue to do that after the pandemic. Have those little feet in the grocery store and the airports. You stand 6 feet behind me, I stand 6 feet behind you. We are good to go. But I think the best thing about the pandemic, and there's no real good thing that's happened from the pandemic, but the best one for us is virtual client meetings. It's allowed us to communicate immediately with our clients. Interacting face-to-face obviously is not possible at this time, and wearing masks in meetings is not ideal. So being able to have our clients right in front of us to share our screen and to interact, I'm doing that 3 to 4 times a day. So with all the changes that we've made, and we've made a lot of them over the last few months, and Zoom's just one of them, I cannot thank our staff enough. They have been unbelievable in their ability to adapt, and really we've been all forced to change because of the pandemic. Adapt, not complain even one bit, and just think, what's the best way that we can service our clients in a different way? So thank you to all of them, and thank you to our clients. Obviously, your flexibility has been huge. We wouldn't be able to do all the things that we are doing and the changes that we're making without your ability to allow us to do so. I'm also glad that we're able to be your pre-show, if you will, to the debate tonight. I don't know how this worked out. We scheduled this months and months ago, but nevertheless, we will be right before the next debate here tonight. And Greg, if you don't mind, I'm going to interrupt you as many times as I possibly can, just so the people at home can feel as comfortable as they can in getting ready for tonight. One more thing before I introduce Greg. A little bit of housekeeping. There are 2 items. One, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button. That Q&A button allows you to communicate directly with 3 individuals, myself, Elaine, and Greg. Now, typically I walk around with the microphone at the end of Greg's presentation or whoever's speaking for us, and we're able to ask questions. This time, you're able to ask questions throughout the presentation. Again, just the 3 of us will see it. And then from there, Greg can obviously answer the questions during his presentation or wait till the end. The next thing is a very, very, very brief survey. It is 2 questions at the very end. I will give our host the cue. He will turn off the session for the event, and 2 very brief questions. I promise it will take 15 seconds, but I very much value, and our entire team values, your opinion. So please, please take that time. We appreciate it. Now, to introduce Greg, introduce a man who probably doesn't need much introduction for our firm. Greg has joined us, this is now his 3rd time. The first time was in 2012, the second term for Obama, and then 4 years ago, of course, the Trump versus Clinton. We were at the IMA, if I remember right, which is now Newfields. So he's back with us again a month before the election, and we love Greg. He truly has unbiased opinions and political analysis, which is really refreshing nowadays. So we're glad that Greg's back. And obviously, if you're here and you've seen him before, there's a reason why you're back. And if you're new to Greg, you won't be disappointed. So for the past 40 years, Greg Valliere has specialized in covering economic issues, taxes, the Federal Reserve, and of course, politics. He has held numerous positions, including Director of Research at the Charles Schwab Washington Research Group. Greg currently is the Chief U.S. Political Strategist at AGF Investments, a global asset management firm headquartered in Toronto, Canada. Greg is frequently a guest on CNN, Fox Business TV, Bloomberg TV, and CBS Radio News. He is frequently quoted in the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, and the Washington Post. And Greg, you don't have this on your list, but I logged onto Yahoo Finance about a month ago, and sure enough, boom, right there, video of Mr. Valliere. So Greg, thank you very much for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Mr. Greg Valliere. I'll throw it to you.
Thank you very much, both of you. Wonderful introductions, most appreciated. I assume you can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right, great. So I've got a lot to talk about tonight, obviously, with the debate coming up and an election less than 2 weeks away. I wanted to start with just a few comments on how this horrible pandemic has affected Washington, D.C., where I've lived for 40-some years. I want to talk a little bit about how we have a new economic toolkit to deal with a weakening economy. I'll talk a little bit about what this means for U.S.-China relations, but I'll spend the majority of my allotted time talking about how the COVID virus has affected the U.S. political climate and the election. We'll talk about Trump and Biden. We'll talk about investment implications, the Senate races, and then I'll finish with a few comments on why we could have a disputed election. So let me just start by saying that I think in April, May, a lot of us were concerned that the U.S. economy was headed for a severe slowdown. Some people even talked about a depression. It didn't happen. The economy is hardly perfect right now, and this disease has taken quite a human toll. But at the same time, Washington, infamous for being dysfunctional, actually came up with a toolkit that made a big difference. Monetary and fiscal policy changed. On the fiscal side, the Congress has spent over $3 trillion on aid to state and local governments, aid to people facing foreclosure, on and on and on. And I think there will be one more stimulus bill. As you know, that Nancy Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin are still ironing out final details of a plan. I'm not optimistic that that plan would get enacted because Mitch McConnell is not enthusiastic about it, and most of his troops, Republicans in Congress, are not enthusiastic either. So it may take a little longer. It might even take until after the inauguration, but another big fiscal stimulus is certain, in my opinion. The critics have been saying that this is raising the deficit by way too much. In the fiscal year that just ended, our deficit was 3.1 trillion. In this new year, it'll probably be around 2 trillion. And by the middle of this decade, I think U.S. total debt will exceed $30 trillion. Yet, I can say honestly that I don't lose sleep right now over the deficit because of the other part of the toolkit. And that other part, obviously, is monetary policy, the Federal Reserve. I would argue that one of the great heroes of this last 7 months, as Evan said, has been Jerome Powell. I mean, obviously, the real heroes are the doctors and nurses and medical personnel who risk their own lives to protect others. But from a policy standpoint, I would argue that the Fed has done a remarkable job. I think that Powell is committed to doing whatever it takes to keep the economy and the markets in good shape. I think the only two things he wouldn't do would be to go to negative interest rates. The Fed doesn't like that idea. They feel it hasn't worked in Europe. It's a disincentive to savers. And secondly, I think the Fed would not consider buying equities if the stock market should slump. Other than that, they'll do whatever it takes. They'll keep the federal funds rate close to zero for at least 3 years. They will tolerate somewhat higher inflation. So I think the combination of an aggressive Fed and fiscal policy in Congress, and we'll get more, has made a big difference. It's a major reason why the U.S. economy has done better in the last few months than people had expected. The second big theme coming out of COVID is a clear deterioration in relations between the US and China, actually between Canada and China, England and China, Western Europe and China, Australia and China, as all of these countries agree that the Chinese government was not forthcoming about the virus and took way too long to alert the world as to what was coming. This in Washington is not exclusively a Donald Trump crusade. It's a bipartisan issue. You see a lot of Democrats, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Chuck Schumer, all saying that the Chinese have to be treated pretty harshly. They are angry over the way China treats its dissidents, whether it's Hong Kong or the way they treat Muslims in Western China. And I think there's a great deal of animosity over the Chinese hacking into so many U.S. firms, especially U.S. firms that are working on vaccines. So I do not see a quick let's kiss and make up scenario, even if Biden were to win. I think Biden knows that Democrats would not be enthusiastic to climb right back in to bed with the Chinese. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if next year there's legislation that would reward American companies that bring jobs back to America from China, manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, things like that. So that's a second big implication of the COVID crisis that I think may last for a while. The third, and the one that is my favorite subject and we'll spend a lot of time on, is obviously the political environment and how it changed dramatically because of this pandemic. First of all, I would say that if I was with all of you in late February, early March, I would have told you without hesitation that Donald Trump was the favorite to win re-election. He had won acquittal in the Senate in the impeachment trial. He had an economy that had a remarkable unemployment rate, under 4%, and he looked like he was in pretty good shape politically. And then the virus came. And as the virus got more intense, the public opinion polls, this is not just my opinion, but the public opinion polls showed that a majority of Americans thought that he didn't do a good job, that he was dismissive of the virus initially, as we all saw in the Bob Woodward tapes. He was perhaps not empathetic enough. He was inconsistent. Do you wear a mask? Don't you? Should you shut down? Should you open up? And as the summer went on, Trump's job approval ratings fell, and Joe Biden became the clear frontrunner. So here we are now, getting into late October. So where do things stand now in this election? First and foremost, I'll tell you something I say in every one of my speeches, and that is you underestimate Donald Trump at your own peril. He's a very, very aggressive campaigner, as we all know. He has tremendous energy. He outworked Hillary Clinton. He clearly has outworked Joe Biden. He has a ruthlessness about him. He'll say things that gets under people's skin. And I don't dismiss him as a very effective campaigner. In fact, I would note that exactly 4 years ago today, Hillary Clinton was leading in Michigan by 12 points, and she lost. Her lead dissipated in just 2 weeks. Biden's lead in Michigan is not as high as Hillary Clinton's was. So it's still maybe a little too early to totally write off Donald Trump, in my opinion. So I wanted to tell you, I get the same question 4 or 5 times a day. And that question is this going to be a repeat of 2016? A lot of people think it might be, that Trump will come back aggressively and pull it out at the last minute. But let me tell you, there are 3 or 4 things that I think are significantly different from 2016. First of all, to my astonishment, the Republicans are short on money. They haven't raised that much money. The Democrats have far outraised the Republicans. Joe Biden raised an astonishing $383 million in the month of September. And I'm told that Donald Trump is furious because they're not running enough ads around the country. They've run out of money. Michael Bloomberg just pumped $100 million into Florida. That has forced the Biden camp to redouble its efforts in Florida and perhaps neglect their efforts in the northern part of the US. So this money advantage, I think, is the first big difference from 2016. A second big difference is a dramatic shift in a couple of key demographic groups away from Trump and toward Biden. The first is female voters. I've seen some astonishing numbers. I've seen polls showing that Biden's lead over Trump among females is 25%. Biden is doing better among women than Hillary Clinton did 4 years ago. A lot of women care about Obamacare and pre-existing conditions and reproductive rights, and they worry about Donald Trump. And Biden now has a huge lead with this part of the population. The other group is a little more interesting, in my opinion, and unexpected, and that's senior citizens, many of whom are displeased with Trump's handling of the virus. And of course, as we all know, senior citizens have borne a disproportionate burden in fatalities from this horrible disease. So senior citizens have now made Arizona and Florida races a toss-up. I would have told you 6 months ago that Trump would win in Arizona and Florida. Now it looks less likely. So that's another big difference. And then finally, I would just say again, in 2016, we did not have COVID. And this has become an obsession with our president. He holds rallies where people don't wear masks. He exposes people. He's a fierce critic now of Dr. Fauci. And I just think that this issue, this issue of COVID is certainly not going to help the president. And it's an issue that obviously we didn't even have 4 years ago. So the second question I get all the time is, could Trump come back? Is there a narrative that would allow Trump to come back? And my answer is, it's not out of the question. So let me give you a few examples of how he could still make this a photo finish. First of all, the Trump camp clearly is hoping that Joe Biden makes a gaffe tonight, and Joe Biden is very capable of making a gaffe. He does that frequently. I've known Biden for almost 50 years. He's not quite the same Joe Biden I knew 50 years ago. Sometimes he can't find the right words. Sometimes he stumbles. And it's possible that in the debate tonight, Trump will look more powerful and Biden may stumble, not out of the question. A second part of this narrative that Trump could still come back and win involves an assertion that many people make that the polls are just absolutely wrong. The polls were not very good, as we know, in 2016. I've talked to poll takers. They feel they have a better handle on their secret sauce, their respondents. They feel they have the right number of, young, old, black, white, rich, poor, male, female, and they think they have that down. But they'll tell you in private, they still have issues with turnout. Turnout is very hard to predict. And I would argue that Donald Trump supporters would turn out in a hurricane. Whereas, let's say you're in Columbus, Ohio on election day and it's cold and rainy and windy. I mean, are the kids from Ohio State going to vote? Well, most of them are probably not in school, but would you have a lesser turnout in terrible weather? I don't think you'd have a lesser turnout among Trump supporters. And that's something the poll takers can't get correct. I'd also say about polls that I don't believe any one single poll. I am a big fan of a great website that I recommend to all of you. It's called realclearpolitics.com. And in the upper right-hand corner every morning, they have an aggregation of all of the recent polls, and they average it out. This morning, I think they showed Biden ahead by something like 9 points, but the battleground states were quite a bit closer. I look at that, but I'm not even positive I believe that number, because some people will tell poll takers one thing and do something else when they actually get in the voting booth. So I do believe in trends. A trend would be significant, if not the precise number. The trend in late summer was clearly toward Biden. And now in the last week or so, maybe there's been a slight tightening of the race, but probably not dramatic. I also would just make a confession. I have a guilty pleasure. On this website, realclearpolitics.com, they also list the Las Vegas betting odds. And they've been pretty good. They catch trends pretty quickly. This morning, it showed that Biden had a 64% chance of winning. That's up from just a few days ago because Biden is looking a little stronger in Pennsylvania. So there still are things that could affect the narrative, and I would just give you two more quickly. Could there be a scandal that could affect Biden in the last 2 weeks? Could there be something with Hunter Biden and Ukraine? Hunter Biden, I won't go into. He has a very controversial background. You can Google him and find out all about the dirt. I don't think this Ukraine story is sufficient to derail Joe Biden's campaign. It was brought by Rudy Giuliani and Steve Bannon. So consider the source. Bannon is under indictment. But it'll be in the news. And this is probably going to be a distraction for Biden in the final 2 weeks. It probably will be tonight in the debate. And then just finally, I would make this point. The strongest argument for Trump coming back and winning is not, the polls. It's not Biden making a gaffe. It's really all about Biden's agenda, which has moved pretty sharply to the left. So at the beginning of the summer, Biden sat down with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, and they figured out what the agenda would be. Biden didn't buy onto everything. He doesn't want to ban fracking, for example. But Biden did buy on to student loan relief, to more spending on health care, on environmental stuff, but in particular, taxes. And I would argue that the Biden tax agenda is a weak spot that Trump could still exploit. So you look at the Biden agenda: higher taxes on the wealthy, higher taxes on corporations going from 21% to 28%, a new corporate minimum tax, higher capital gains taxes, higher estate taxes, a higher Social Security tax, a new Wall Street transaction tax, and on and on. And as Elaine knows, I've been doing this for a long time, and I have rarely seen a politician succeed when he or she says, vote for me, I'm going to raise your taxes. That's usually not a very persuasive prescription. That's where Trump should focus. He shouldn't focus on getting into a Twitter fight with Dr. Fauci or Leslie Stahl from 60 Minutes. He should look at the Biden agenda. That's where I think Trump still has an opportunity. That said, I think the most likely outcome would almost certainly be a Biden majority in the individual state countrywide vote. I think that is quite likely. And I would have to say right now, I'm thinking Biden could get about 300 electoral college votes. And as you know, we need 270. Two more things that I wanted to talk about this evening concerning this election. The next subject is the other election, a big election, and that's for the Senate, where Mitch McConnell has a 53 to 47 seat majority. It's a pretty tentative majority. And looking at seats that are up, I see maybe 4 Republican seats that could fall, maybe only 1 Democratic seat in Alabama, although Michigan has tightened up. But when I look at all the races, I, believe it or not, can come up with a scenario of a tie, 50-50, which would be broken by the party in power, presumably the Democrats. Why is this all so important? Well, I think that investors and the markets prefer divided government. I think that a blue wave with the Democrats controlling everything would be greeted with some anxiety in the financial markets. I have a dear friend on Wall Street who calls me up every 2 years and says, Greg, don't forget, divided government is good because it means they do less harm. And there may be some truth to that. So I think if one party controls everything, if the Democrats do win the Senate, and the odds slightly favor that happening, not only would there be anxiety over tax hikes moving quickly, I think there would be anxiety for certain sectors. The defense sector might not see any more spending increases. The fossil fuel sector, oil, coal, gas, could have a much more less favorable climate. Financial services could be under pressure, the healthcare sector. sector. A lot of sectors could be negatively affected if one party controls everything. So the final big subject on this election that I want to make, and this is a subject that I sometimes don't even like to talk about, is the possibility of a disputed election. You hear this all the time on Capitol Hill. You hear this all the time in the markets that it could occur. And there are two scenarios that I think are quite troubling. The first is, I'm not convinced we're going to know on the night of November 3rd who won. There's such a tidal wave of mail-in ballots. It could take some states, Pennsylvania, for example, several days to count all of these ballots. I would just point out that in New York State, this summer, there were primaries for House seats. It took 6 weeks for them to declare who actually won these races. I'm not predicting it would take 6 weeks to find out who won the presidency, but we may go to bed on the night of November 3rd without knowing for sure who won. The second scenario is more troublesome, and it goes like this. Let's say it looks like Trump has lost narrowly. He loses Pennsylvania by half a point, loses Arizona by half a point, and it loses by a few points in the Electoral College. He will appeal this. He has made this quite clear during the summer that he considers this to be a rigged election. He feels adamantly that mail-in ballots are fraudulent, and there have been a couple of examples, one in North Carolina, one in New Jersey, where there may have been some tampering. But I think I think Trump's attitude is that he would, considering how litigious he is, I think he would go to his Attorney General, William Barr, and say, I won this election and I want you to take this all the way to the Supreme Court. And I don't have to remind all of you that we've seen this movie before in the year 2000, when it took the Supreme Court until December 12th to rule that George W. Bush actually did beat Al Gore. Something like this time is not out of the question, and I think this issue of mail-in ballots will be the premise of a possible suit by Donald Trump. So for the markets, this could be a difficult stretch. One final topic, looking at 2021, then I'll stop. So what will things look like if Biden wins? What will things look like if Trump wins? If Biden wins, I think right after inauguration, which is January 20th, I think he would the next day pick up the phone and call Trudeau, Macron, Boris Johnson, Angela Merkel, maybe call Xi, maybe call Putin, and just try to establish better relations, considering how dysfunctional relations have been in the last few years between the US and these countries. I think Biden would do that right away. Second, I think Biden would begin looking at regulations, which of course were eased under Donald Trump. I think Biden would move to toughen them back up again, whether it's emissions, factory emissions, energy emissions, car emissions, maybe some labor standards. So I think he'd move on that. And then third, I think Biden would move on a massive stimulus bill, which the markets would like. A stimulus bill, assuming we don't get anything from Pelosi and Mnuchin in the next few days. Then I think Biden would begin looking at the tax increases. That might not come until late spring, early summer. The impact on the economy might not come until 2022. The effective date is unclear, but I do feel that Biden might worry that the economy is still fragile, and he might worry that he doesn't want to antagonize the markets right away. So my hunch is the tax hikes are coming, but they may come a little later rather than sooner. And then finally, what would Trump do in a second term? Well, he'll finish building the wall. He'll find the money for that. He wants his tax cuts, which expire in the middle of this decade, to be permanently extended. He will, I think, fight pretty hard for infrastructure. He'll continue to nominate conservative judges, and assuming if the Senate stays Republican, that trend would continue, an amazing trend of the judiciary moving to the right. I think Trump would still use tariffs as a weapon. I think that the one thing that sort of is depressing with both of these candidates was, regardless of who wins, I see neither of them doing anything significant on budget deficits. Trump would spend more on tax cuts. Biden might raise taxes, but it's not to reduce the deficit. It would be to spend money on new stuff. So that's an issue that's going to have to be dealt with later in the decade. But for now, I think that the economic outlook is pretty good. I worry like everyone about a disputed election, but I think that once again, we have Jerome Powell at the ready to do whatever is necessary to keep the markets and the economy in good shape. So I'm going to stop there, Evan. I would be delighted to take questions.
Sure. It looks like we have one question that came through on the Q&A. So you want to check out that?
You have an assistant. You've got a helper.
I do. This is Mr. Ace Beadle. Want to say hi?
Hi.
Hello. Nice to see you.
Say nice to see you too.
Nice to see you too.
So the first one is, if the Democrats take the Senate,
Yep.
is there a difference in legislation that might be passed if there were 50 or 51 seat majority versus 52 plus?
Yeah, that's a really good question because the Democrats have a couple of moderate members. And you know from Indiana, you've had moderate Democrats as well. But there is Joe Manchin of West Virginia is not a certain vote. And the John Tester of Montana is also not a certain vote for the Democrats. So I would argue that the Democrats need more than 50 or even 51. They might need 52, maybe even 53 to get a lot done. Now, a question that always comes up is, could they change the filibuster rule? I think Biden is lukewarm on that. He's definitely lukewarm on packing the Supreme Court. I think he remembers, of course, or knows about Franklin Roosevelt's experience in 1937. It blew up in Roosevelt's face. I don't think Biden wants to do anything that radical, and I'm not sure he'd want to make changes in the filibuster rules either. So I think the Democrats would not have a guaranteed easy path legislatively unless they got up to 52 or 53 seats. And that's a long shot.
The next question we have is, what is the range of stimulus deal post-election if we don't get one passed here? And obviously, it could go either way, Trump or Biden, but I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, I think my guess is we'll probably see an announcement in the next 2 or 3 days that they've reached an agreement in principle. But the big problem, as I said earlier, is that Mitch McConnell and most of the Republicans are incredulous that they would have to support a $2 trillion stimulus bill. They have no stomach for it. So if it falls apart, after the election, I think Trump would not be as motivated. A lot of these people might not be as motivated. And this could drag on through the holidays and drag into January before we actually got it. With Biden in charge, he would use an arcane procedure called reconciliation, which allows Congress to pass once a year a tax or budget bill with only 50 votes. So I'm sure that Biden would use that provision and get a very, very big stimulus bill. If there's not one in the next 2 months, Biden will get a stimulus bill enacted, in my opinion, by early to mid-February. And I think it would be maybe as much as $3 trillion.
I'm not sure if you touched on infrastructure, but is there any sort of infrastructure deal that you think post-election?
It's one of the very few issues, Evan, that could unite the two parties. I mean, the two parties right now are so hopelessly divided on a wide range of issues. But I do think that infrastructure is one where everyone agrees the roads are terrible in much of the country. We need to spend money on dams and bridges, things of that sort. And I think you could get something. The issue, of course, is how or whether you pay for it. And I'm not convinced that anyone has a stomach to pay for it. We really are in an extraordinary period now where people don't want to pay for anything. And we could get a $1 trillion infrastructure bill. It would be good for jobs, it would be good for the economy, but it would cost another $1 trillion. I mean, a logical solution would be to raise the gasoline tax, but any kind of tax increase is, anathema to Congress. So I do think we get an infrastructure bill, but I'm not sure how we pay for it.
So we continue to see, and you can't see me right now, sorry. There we go. We continue to see a huge disconnect between Wall Street and Main Street. So one of the questions came in about that. Income inequality, huge
Yeah.
problem. A large segment of the population is suffering from the pandemic and job losses. How can they live the American dream? I think it's a good question.
Yeah, and I think that attitude is increasingly prevalent in both parties, more so, of course, with the Democrats and the progressives, who are going to be insurgent. Let me just digress for 1 second. I think Joe Biden's greatest political challenge next year will come from the left. The progressives, headed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, it will pressure Biden on a lot of legislation, especially something that involves income inequality, as the question suggests. So I think that there'll be an immediate attempt to deal with that with the tax proposals early next year. There will be, in the stimulus bill, there will be tax credits for childcare, for home buying, a wide range of tax credits. And I also think there will be quite clearly a big tax hike on the wealthy, a big tax hike on corporations. And I think the one tax that infuriates the Democratic progressives more than any other is this issue of a corporate minimum tax. They point out that Amazon, I think a couple of years ago, made $11 billion and paid no taxes. They got a refund. I think something like that has to be addressed. And I think that while the outlook, in my opinion, for the tech sector is fairly benign, I don't see any imminent antitrust breakup. The story this week, I think, indicates we've got years to go before there's a resolution of that. But there is a threat to the tech sector and a lot of corporate sectors, and that threat is a minimum corporate tax. I think the chances are excellent that we would get it, and I think that's one thing the progressives will be absolutely adamant about getting enacted into law. So does this resolve income inequality? No. It's a complicated story. It involves better education, better job training, a lot of things that could help that story. But I do think there will be no way around a significant tax hike for the wealthy and in some tax reduction for lower and middle class people.
So if Biden wins, how will that impact the Federal Reserve? Are they thinking do you think they'll still want to keep interest rates low for the next 2 to 3 years? I know they've talked about that a lot.
Yeah, Evan, I think that either Biden or Trump would support keeping Jerome Powell. I think they'd be crazy to get rid of him. Trump and Powell were at odds for a year or two, but they made up. This summer, reportedly, Trump called up Powell and said, "You're doing a great job." And I think Trump, if he's reelected, would strongly consider reappointing him. If Biden is elected, I think it's a no-brainer. I think Biden would keep Powell. Powell, I think, is 67. I'm told he would like to stay on for a while. I think he's been invaluable. So I think both Trump or Biden would move to keep the Fed chairman. His term expires in February of 2022, and I think he might be inclined to stay on for a little while longer.
Do you have any concern of civil unrest? I mean, obviously, it's sort of a question that we all could guess, but depending on who wins, how do you think that might impact the markets?
I get the question in every briefing I do, and it's not an easy question to answer because I follow financial stuff. This is a little out of my realm, but I would say that there's two aspects to this story. One is the rioting that's gone on mostly in Portland, Oregon, a few other places, and the other is this horrible increase of urban gun violence in Chicago on weekends, in New York, Atlanta, Washington, D.C. I think that Biden has made it clear that he feels defunding the police is a bad idea. Trump keeps saying that Biden wants to defund the police, but that's just not true. I think Biden recognizes that you have to have a vigorous police force. I think, though, the story in Portland with the Antifa is different. I think at some point that's going to have to be dealt with harshly. The problem is in my humble opinion. Donald Trump seems to inflame these issues. Instead of rhetoric that could maybe calm things down, he's always saying things, after Charlottesville or wherever, that seem to put a little gasoline on the fire. So an issue that where Trump should be doing better is one where a lot of voters say, no, he's too rhetorically aggressive on this. He doesn't want to bring people together. I mean, there's a lot of areas where I think that Trump could be doing much, much better, and that's one of them. There's a lot of areas where I think the Democrats should be doing better. I'm astonished to see two stories in particular. The Democrats have not made any kind of concerted effort with Hispanic voters. I mean, Hispanics are 16% of the country, yet I saw very few Hispanics at the Democrats' convention. In South Florida, where Hillary Clinton won Hispanic votes by 27% 4 years ago, you see that the Hillary and Trump tied with Hispanic voters. So I don't get that. I don't understand why they haven't been more aggressive. And the other thing I don't get, frankly, is that the Democrats have not really made a huge issue of climate change. I mean, you look at the fires in California, you look at icebergs falling into the sea, you look at the intensity of hurricanes now, and you'd have to conclude something's going on. Yet I haven't heard the Democrats mention climate change as much as they should.
Some could argue there's a lack of quality candidates at the top for
Yep.
either party.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on potentially, a third party having a chance?
Yeah, I mean, I despair to see that the center has been hollowed out. And I consider myself a centrist. I mean, I could support a Paul Ryan or a Mitt Romney or a John Kasich, but there are some moderate to conservative Democrats who I like as well. But the center has been hollowed out. You've got on the one side an insurgency by progressives, and on the other side, you've got the Trump Republicans, and who's left in the middle? It's a dismaying. You go back and look at the history of third-party candidates in our country. They usually don't do very well. In 1912, you had a significant third-party run by Teddy Roosevelt against Woodrow Wilson and Howard Taft, but no third-party candidate has won even one state in the U.S. since 1968. That was George Wallace. Ross Perot did pretty well, but he did not win even one state. So it's not easy putting together a third party. It would be difficult. That said, it is maddening to see that moderates who decide they want to try to compromise become pariahs in their own party. They're ostracized if they want to compromise. I would think that compromising can be a good thing to get some things done, but you get rejection in your own party if you go that way. So very quickly, what are we looking for in 2024? I think both parties are facing widening fissures. On the one side, among the Republicans, there's huge differences. Some of it's stylistic. Trump, of course, is so bombastic. I think that stylistically, the Republicans will tone it down in 2024. But you will have a fight between the Trump faction, and there are people who believe that Donald Trump Jr. or Ivanka Trump might run. And then you see the more moderate Republicans. I think there's going to be a dozen or so running. Your former governor, Mike Pence, will be in the mix, obviously. We haven't heard the last of Marco Rubio. We haven't heard the last of Ted Cruz. There'll be a lot of Republicans jumping into this race, maybe even as many as a dozen Republicans jumping into this race. On the Democrat side, I think Biden if he wins, he's in for one term. Even Biden has said he would be a caretaker from one generation to the next. So Kamala Harris would certainly be on the short list. She's an interesting player. She's sort of a Rorschach test. You see in her whatever you want to see. Progressives say she's too conservative. Conservatives say she's too progressive. So take your pick. But I think she'll be a major player. But I think a lot of other Democrats would consider a run if let's say she becomes president through a Biden health problem, or Biden steps down after one term, then she would be a clear player. But I could see others, Pete Buttigieg, Julian Castro, Cory Booker, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, maybe even Cuomo in New York. So I think both parties will have a big, big field in 2024. And one final comment on this is it's time for some fresh blood. Nancy Pelosi is 80. Dianne Feinstein is 87. Biden turned 78 right after the election. Trump is 74. You look at Chuck Grassley, the president pro tem of the Senate. He's 87. Pelosi's two assistants are 81, Steny Hoyer and James Clyburn. It's really time for fresh blood, and I think it finally comes into the system in 2024.
So what are some of your thoughts on the Affordable Care Act? I know Trump's kind of gone back and forth with the pre-existing conditions and with the pandemic surging. Where do you envision that going? Let's say he wins.
You know, I got to tell you, Evan, we'll be debating this for decades to come. This issue of healthcare, I'm convinced, has become theological between the two parties. One party favoring a much bigger government role, that's the Democrats, the other party favoring tax incentives and the private sector. So this argument is going to be litigated and relitigated and relitigated. The one thing that's changed, in my opinion, is that the country has come around to really supporting the provision on pre-existing conditions. I think that has now been accepted. Not all of Obamacare, but pre-existing conditions has to be a component of any kind of health care bill. The problem for the Republicans is that, you know, they've been very adamant in saying they want to kill Obamacare. I get that, but they can't come up with an alternative. Every couple of weeks, Trump says, we've got a plan coming. It's going to be out in the next 2 or 3 weeks. We've got a really great health plan, and it never comes out. They still don't have one. And that's a problem. They may come up tonight in the debate. That's a real Achilles heel that the Republicans haven't come up with any kind of solution. So we go back and forth. So if Biden wins, maybe for 4 years, we have a more aggressive version of Obamacare. We spend more money. Maybe we expand Medicare. Maybe we expand the WIC program, Women, Infants, and Children. But the healthcare will expand. And I think the major reason is not political. The major reason is just simply demographic.
What about Amy Coney Barrett? Is she a shoo-in for the Supreme Court?
Yeah, she's a shoo-in. I think a very impressive candidate. She did well. It was hard to come up with something against her. What the Democrats resent greatly is that Merrick Garland was not even granted a hearing 8 months before an election. And here she's going to be confirmed right before an election. So the Democrats have angrily called for adding more justices to the Supreme Court. And as I said earlier, I just don't see it happening. I don't see Biden endorsing that. So you've got to say that one of the really fundamental changes in the U.S. is the movement by the judiciary to the right. And Mitch McConnell is the architect. Sometimes I run into conservatives who don't like him and I say, hey, you guys should erect a statue to Mitch McConnell. He has now been almost single-handedly responsible for the confirmation of over 200 federal judges, 2 going on 3 in the Supreme Court, over 100 appeals court judges, nearly 100 federal judges. These are lifetime appointments. Most of the new judges are young, late 40s, early 50s. So this is a really fundamental change that we see in the Supreme Court. And I would conclude that it'll be at least a couple of decades before the Supreme Court gets an ideological balance. For quite some time to come, there will be this clear tilt to the right.
What would a Biden-China relationship look like?
I would answer that, Evan, by saying it depends on China. I mean, does China still desire more territory in the South China Sea? Do they want hegemony over that entire part of the world? Are they still desirous of Taiwan? Do they still treat their dissidents horribly? Is it still really a communist police state? So a lot of this depends on China's behavior. If China becomes more moderate, I don't see signs of it now, their economy is getting better. I think that unless there are concrete signs that they're getting moderate, there'll be a freeze, a deep freeze for some time. The deep freeze would be worse if Trump wins re-election. But as I said earlier, I think even with a Biden presidency, he would be reluctant to warm up quickly to China because Democrats are not in favor of that. So I think this would continue for some time. Maybe China could play a constructive role with North Korea. That's always possible. Trump has always thought that was something that could happen. By the way, I should mention, usually when we think of global problems, we always worry first and foremost about the Middle East. I'm encouraged right now over what's happened in the Mideast. Trump gets a little credit. The much maligned Jared Kushner gets a little credit. They helped to put together a treaty between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and then Israel and Bahrain. There's reports that Israel and Saudi Arabia may get closer. This is totally isolated Iran and the Hezbollah in that part of the world. So for the first time that I can remember, the Mideast is not at the very top of my list of things that I worry about. That said, there still has to be some accommodation for the Palestinians. That still has to be part of any kind of agreement. But I just see the Israelis and a lot of their former enemies getting closer. I think that's a good thing.
So with China-U.S. relations on ice, will we continue to see supply chain issues, or will the U.S. companies be able to meet increasing demand? That is the next question.
I think there will be supply chain issues. We barely got phase one done of the China trade deal, and some of it still hasn't been implemented. Phase two, which deals with some very serious issues like intellectual property theft, is nowhere in sight. I think phase two is unrealistic to expect anytime soon. So yeah, I do think there'll be supply issues. I think, though, that if Biden wins, I'm not saying he's going to lift all the tariffs right away. I'm not saying he's going to rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership right away, but I think Biden would be far less inclined to impose more tariffs. I think he would use that weapon sparingly, whereas Trump has used tariffs aggressively. So I think there would be a difference, but no, I still think we'll have some hiccups in the trade relationship and the supply chain in the next couple of years.
We have a couple questions around investing and should we sit tight. I don't know if that's part of your territory. I know it's part of ours, but at least I figured I'd throw it out to you.
I defer to you guys on that. I have a Series 7, but I defer to you guys. I got enough to worry about here in Washington without saying you should sell your Microsoft or buy Amazon. I leave that in totally to you and your colleagues and your mother, and I would respect your judgment far than anyone should respect mine on investing.
Good answer. We have a question around Hunter Biden. I know you touched on that a little bit. China relationships. Is there anything else you want to mention around if Joe were to win, how that relationship could impact anything, and would they pursue any sort of legal ramifications?
I don't know. I mean, again, anyone interested can Google Hunter Biden. He's led quite a disreputable life, quite a long series of things that a lot of families face. I mean, it's not unique. A lot of presidents face. Look at, I aged myself. Look at Billy Carter. He was an embarrassment to Jimmy Carter. Hillary Clinton had a brother, Tony Rodham, who was kind of a wheeler dealer and an embarrassment to her. So it happens in big families. And Hunter Biden is, as a person, is deeply flawed. I am not convinced that there is a smoking gun. There may be, which there's a story today in the New York Post about the Bidens in China. There have been stories earlier in the week, as you all know, about the Bidens and Ukraine. I'm not sure how much there is there, but I would divorce that from the issue of Hunter Biden. He's a very flawed soul, but I am not convinced from what I've seen that there's a direct tie between Joe Biden and these Ukraine and China stories. I'm not prepared to go there on that. It seems like whenever we get 2 weeks before an election, something crazy comes up, like Hillary's emails, or, there's always some kind of story that comes up at the last minute, which makes me a little suspicious of the timing. I'm also suspicious, quite frankly, by the New York Times, which ran this mammoth story on Trump's taxes. I mean, we all knew he didn't pay his taxes. I think the bigger story is, who does he owe $400 million to? But I would say that the timing by the New York Times was outrageous. They waited until 4 weeks before the election. They could have run that story months and months ago. So on both sides, there's an effort to pump up scandals at the very last minute. But I increasingly think that the vast majority of Americans have already made up their minds and have already voted. So no matter what comes up with Rudy Giuliani and Steve Bannon and Ukraine and Hunter Biden, it may be too late to really affect the election.
All right, we have a special guest who has a question for you.
Greg, how many flies will be on TV tonight?
How many flies will be on TV tonight?
How many flies?
Fly on the head with.
Oh, that's very funny. That's very funny. We'll see. That was pretty funny with Mike Pence with the fly in his head. That's a question I cannot answer. So congratulations.
I know our economy. We've never been pulled into a recession by another country, but we've obviously pulled others into a recession. Do you have any feeling on whether whoever wins? So obviously Trump is right now. So let's just say if Biden wins, how that might impact international economies. That was a question from earlier. And by the way, if I wasn't able to get to everyone's questions, I sincerely apologize. You had a ton of questions, which is awesome.
That's great. You guys have given me a very good workout. I've enjoyed it. I would say that if Biden wins, there would at least be more predictability on trade. You might disagree with certain trade proposals, but I think a lot of our allies were left uncertain. Trump is on many issues, Trump is very erratic, shall we say. He often blindsides his own aides. I've talked to many of his aides who are driven crazy by the fact that he'll blindside them on an issue. And he's done that to some of our allies on trade. I think for trade and the markets internationally, all they really are looking for is a sense of predictability. Confidence is so important with the markets and with the economy. And I think that Biden, he's low-keyed, he's fragile, he's not a dynamo, but I think that Biden would represent a more tranquil force, not a bombastic force, which, every time there's a G10 meeting, you go, oh my God, what's Trump going to do this time at the G10? I don't think that would be said of Biden. So I do think that on a lot of international economic issues, we would go back to a climate of more cooperation with our allies.
So what are your thoughts on the media? Some people say the media is a bit biased. What are your overall thoughts? And obviously you can touch on the Google thing as well, related to Biden's, Hunter Biden.
Well, there's obviously, as we know, there are media outlets that support one party or another. You've got Fox TV and the Wall Street Journal editorial page that are very pro-Trump. You've got MSNBC and CNN and most all of the networks, and the Washington Post and the New York Times are very, very anti-Trump. So it's something that's not going to change, something you just have to factor in. When I get up early in the morning, the first thing I look at, other than realclearpolitics.com, I look at the Wall Street Journal's news coverage. I know a lot of their reporters. They're really good reporters, and they are not ideological. They report what's happened in the markets. They report legislation. They talk about what's going on with tax policy. So I tell everybody the Wall Street Journal's news department is my go-to source, because I think they are the least biased of any media source. But otherwise, no, the media, and you could argue some of the tech companies have tilted away from Trump and toward the Democrats, and I'm not sure that's going to change anytime soon. even though you'd have to say the highest ratings of anyone on talk radio is Rush Limbaugh, who's seriously ill, as you know. His cancer is metastasized. And you've got others like Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson. They get phenomenal ratings. But in terms of the TV exposure, yeah, except for Fox, it's pretty leftward group in TV media. I know a lot of the reporters, they're nice people, but they have a bias, and I think you have to acknowledge that.
You touched on the age of a lot of these politicians.
Yeah.
Do you ever think they'll seriously have term limits? Do you think that's even a possibility?
Yeah, that would mean they would have to reform themselves, which is a tall order, in my opinion. Probably unlikely. You know, if I was God for a day, I would enact an age limit. I mean, there's nothing cruel about saying you have to retire at the age of 80. I remember two members of the Senate in particular who were outrageous. You had Strom Thurmond, who served until I think he was 101. You had Robert Byrd, who served until close to 100, and they lost their mental acuity. Totally lost their mental acuity. They were virtually vegetables, but they stayed on, I guess, because they wanted to set a longevity record like, you know, Cal Ripken or something. So I think an age limit would make a lot of sense. You see that in universities, you see that in businesses. There's nothing harsh about 80 as an age limit. I mean, there's some very smart people over 80. Alan Greenspan is probably 90, and he's still sharp as a tack. I knew a great economist, Lyle Gramley, who got his PhD from the University of Indiana. Lyle was razor sharp until he was in his 90s. So it can happen, but I think an age limit would make more sense than term limits.
All right, we've taken a lot of your time. One final question.
Gladly.
You're working in DC. What's
Yep.
that like with the current environment?
Well, COVID has changed everything, you know, and I live in the Watergate, and one of our neighbors, a famous neighbor, died a month ago. That was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We all religiously wore masks because we didn't want to get near her. She was so compromised. She had such, you know, horrible illnesses. No, COVID has really changed everything. It's changed going out to eat. It's changed the way people interact. But I will say, and hopefully not too naively, that Washington did the right thing when we had to. We passed a mammoth stimulus. Some people would say it was too much money, but we had to save the patient. That was the first task. The Federal Reserve has lent a tremendous amount of money. So I do see in a time of crisis like this, the policymakers get together, they do the right thing. We will get another stimulus bill. I think we'll have a pretty decent economy next year, regardless of who wins. So sometimes Washington will impress you and will do the right thing. And on this, I think there's, on economic policy at least, leaving aside other issues, on economic policy at least, I think we've done a pretty good job in Washington.
Greg, thank you so much for joining us. We always appreciate your insight. I follow your newsletter, the daily one, via email, and it's very insightful, and we greatly appreciate you being here. So thank you.
And I would just say that you and your mom and your entire firm are real class acts. You're really, I deal with a lot of firms around the country, and you guys are stand out as a real class act. So it's been an honor and a privilege to be with all of you this evening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Enjoy the debate this evening. I know Elaine just joined the video as well. She'll say a couple of words here, but as a reminder, when we close this out, it's just 15 seconds of your time for 2 questions, survey questions. We'd greatly appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. And Elaine, go for it.
I just want to say thank you, Greg. You never disappoint, as I said earlier, and I miss seeing you in person as well as everyone else who's joined us. So again, thank you to all that joined us, and hopefully you found this beneficial and interesting conversation for you and the rest of your friends anyway. So thank you all, and have a great evening. Thanks, Greg.
Bye. Good night. Thanks for having me.